Okay, so we're here with Sandeep Duggal, CEO of Extron Incorporated. And Sandeep, so we talked last couple of videos about how we got into this supply chain mess and how we certainly can't go back to the way things were before it all started. So how do we move forward? What possible future paths exist?
Well, uh, generally people think of two solutions, right? First is the knee-jerk reaction is do everything domestically. Doing things 100% domestically assumes that the competitive landscape is going to cooperate, and that's generally a bad assumption in a capitalist society like ours. If there's a less expensive way to do it, people will figure it out. There is a in-between path, and it's what we call intelligent globalization. And what intelligent globalization is the idea is that don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Globalization is positive. It takes advantage of the competitive. It plays into the competitive advantage of nations. You know, an old idea from business economics, but it introduces an element of this new knowledge that we've learned over the last 30 years to reconstruct supply chains. So intelligent globalization is a concept that basically says source all your components globally, get the largest percentage of your cost reduction by sourcing what you need to offshore. However, don't compromise on 3 or 4 key elements. The first one is your IP protection. Second is evaluate all your costs in terms of landed cost. And then third is price in resilience, discomfort, and all the other things that we have learned in the last 30 years. That if your IP is pilfered, that's obviously not a desirable situation. There's some cost associated with it. If your supply chain gets interrupted due to port strikes or due to flooding in a different part of the world because you're sole sourced on something, there's an economic cost to that. And most important, just price in this, put some cost to the disruption that we've experienced, either through COVID, natural calamities, or disruption introduced by geopolitics, which is a very new and actually increasingly worrisome element that is entering supply chain lexicon today. So intelligent globalization says source your parts from multiple international locations, but do your final manufacturing in your market in what I would call safe geographies, the United States, Western Europe, and actually even in places where you're going to be closer to your customer. And so you do this last mile manufacturing in a specific location that enables you to manage geopolitics, transportation cost changes, weather interruptions, transportation disruptions, and so on and so forth. And so that brings me to a second concept, which is last mile manufacturing, which is after you've sourced these parts from through intelligent globalization, you put together your final product, and that thereby the term last mile manufacturing. And then you put this into a facility that is ideally, although not as low cost as offshore, you're able to put it into a facility that is intelligently constructed, that has last mile manufacturing, integrated logistics, returns, and a whole slew of sensible services that are operationally adjacent and typically not done together. So it's an improvement on the old manufacturing model, which was you have a manufacturing plant, and you have a separate distribution setup, and then you have a separate return setup. Well, in this concept, you push everything together, and it's a far more intelligent. It's a far more intelligent operation.
How do you know how much of your supply chain to move onshore? 80%, 60%? How do you find the sweet spot in there?
There's no clear single answer. It depends a lot on your supply chain. We have a pictorial that we use, which is if you just take just imagine a graph, and on one side you've got 100% offshore, 100% onshore, and people always thought that, well, the onshore cost is going to be high, the offshore cost is going to be low. And being human, we think very linearly and we say, okay, the two are connected by a straight line. And therefore, if the offshore cost is here and the onshore cost is here, well, there's a straight line between the two. Well, as it turns out, it's not really a straight line. Definitely, while we understand the endpoints of that line, we believe that this line actually drops below, this line actually drops down and then comes back up when you get to fully offshore. There's a cost to putting everything 100% offshore. And you can actually reduce your costs by keeping some element of your supply chain onshore. Lost opportunities have a cost. Excessive transportation has a cost. Stolen IP has a cost. Supply chain interruption, not being able to fulfill orders because you don't have inventory, has a cost. So all those costs kind of add up and say that, hey, if you put a little bit more domestically, you'll actually drop your cost before it begins rising if you put too much onshore. It's fairly clear that there's, assembling printed circuit boards is cheaper in Asia. A lot of it due to labor, but also part of it due to cost of environmental non-compliance offshore and stricter environmental compliance in the United States. That precise asymptote, the lowest cost structure, is not clear in every single industry. Our rule of thumb is that somewhere between 5 and 20% is domestic, and it depends on how bulky your product is, what the cost of capital of your product is. But you can take some pretty sensible guesses and refine it as time goes on. But the key part is pricing in risk. And COVID has taught us, and geopolitics and all geopolitical discontinuities right now have taught us that we're better off thinking more in terms of moving that line to the 10, 15% mark than thinking of it as just need very little onshore. If you get your product made in one place, you will likely get lower cost. But that assumes that you go to certain supply base, to a certain supplier. I would argue that to really take advantage of intelligent globalization, if you don't think of going to what they call top tier suppliers and go to second tier suppliers internationally, your second tier suppliers will be happy at 1/10 the volume of your typical top tier supplier. And oftentimes they will be more cost competitive. So if you source your product in multiple geographies and maybe with multiple suppliers, you oftentimes will not deteriorate your price position if you source intelligently. And this is part of that whole idea of intelligent globalization, right? Strategically think what you want to do to control your supply chain. In today's paradigm, the supply chain is controlled by large contract manufacturers who are often dozens of times larger than the clients they serve. In the intelligent globalization paradigm, you go to smaller contract manufacturers that maybe specify in certain parts, certain components, and you manage them very actively. So it means that OEMs take a far more aggressive and active role in their supply chain. Some VPs of operations, some CEOs, some CFOs really embrace that approach of managing their supply chain. But there's a lot of old school thinking that that still is, I want to outsource 100%. My money is on the first thought process, which is that OEMs really want to control their supply chain. If there's anything that COVID has taught us, is we've got to be strategic about our supply. Risk management is something that hasn't really been thought about in supply chain circles within many OEMs. Obviously, some of the really large companies have thought about this, but the approach has always been to go to large global CMs. And that approach may work very well with the biggest companies who can control the contract manufacturers. But actually, the contract manufacturers are typically in control of the OEMs when it comes to the smaller companies. And so this really is relevant for mid-size and not the largest tens of billions of dollar companies that can actually control their contract manufacturers. So if you're a company that's doing between a few $100 million to, $5 or $10 billion, well, your contract manufacturer is often bigger than you. And you may want to actually have your risk management expertise within your four walls, and think about strategic sourcing globally, of course, as I mentioned earlier, but also think about what pieces you want to keep domestically. So last mile manufacturing is a very, very powerful concept when used appropriately.